remember back in the day when I was still at St. Augustine Seminary studying to be a priest, I was sitting at a table with a bunch of the guys, and one of them was joking about the fact that the people of God, generally speaking, didn't know when the liturgical year actually began. In response to which I laughed along with the group, but then I went back to my room after that and looked up the answer because I didn't know. And the answer is, in the Catholic tradition, the liturgical year actually ends with the Solemnity of Christ the King, and then the new year starts up with the season of Advent. And so given all that, in a certain sense, the time to make New Year's resolutions isn't so much January 1st, but is actually on the Solemnity of Christ the King. And in a certain sense, this particular idea is built into the origins of the actual solemnity. And so in 1925, when Pope Pius XI officially established the Solemnity of Christ the King, what he basically noticed was that a lot of people at the time were trying to establish their sense of purpose and identity by leaning heavily into cultural and political influences. And while he acknowledged that those factors were certainly relevant in terms of establishing, again, a sense of purpose and identity, he said that the real way to establish peace and order and justice in the world was to reaffirm one's sense of identity in Christ, to reestablish the sense of the primacy of Christ the King. Now, in order to give us further guidance in this regard, I want to reflect upon this really famous parable in Jesus' repertoire, the parable of the sheep and the goats, which you find in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. And so basically the parable is emblematic of the final judgment, where the people who are included in the kingdom of God are represented by the sheep, and the ones who are excluded are represented by the goats. And funny enough, when it comes to the sheep, the reason why they're included in the kingdom of heaven is not because of their membership in a particular group, is not because of their level of faith, but rather because of the things that they've done. Particularly, they've engaged in what's called the corporal works of mercy. And these things obviously include feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, visiting the sick, visiting the imprisoned, and then finally burying the dead. In any case, that brings us to the goats, and specifically the question as to why these people are excluded from the kingdom of heaven. And again, it's kind of interesting. They're not excluded because of some egregious violation of love, right? And so they're not guilty of idolatry or murder or that kind of thing. But instead, they're guilty of sins of omission. So because they didn't engage in the corporal works of mercy, therefore they're excluded, again, from the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so given all that, the basic framework of the Solemnity of Christ the King and the parable of the sheep and the goats, I want to give you some practical advice for going forward, especially as you enter into the Advent season. But as a starting point, I'm not going to give an extensive commentary on all 7 corporal works of mercy. And I'm also going to presume that it goes without saying that we're called to kind of build into our regular routine this habit of caring for the poor and visiting the sick and burying the dead. So what I'm going to do instead is focus on perhaps less obvious principles when it comes to the practical application of the corporal works of mercy. So the first thing that comes to mind is to recognize that the corporal works of mercy don't just apply to the someday maybe. And so they're not meant to be brought into application simply when I visit the homeless shelter or help out at the soup kitchen, for example. But instead they're meant to apply very much in the context of my immediate circumstances, in the context of the simple and the humble and the ordinary. And so, for example, when you think about feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, or even visiting the sick and the imprisoned, in a certain sense, these corporal works of mercy specifically apply to when you're taking care of young kids or even elderly parents. And so in a certain sense, the invitation when you're caring for these particular categories of persons is to remember the Lord's words in the context of the gospel. Whatever you do to the least of my brethren, you also do it unto me. And so the invitation is to remember to apply a supernatural outlook when it comes to caring for people in these particular categories. To remember that you're caring not just for them, but for Christ himself. So again, the wording is, whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do it unto me as opposed to for me. So you're actually loving Jesus Christ himself. And so in a certain sense, you're walking in the footsteps of spiritual giants. People like St. Simon of Cyrene, who helps the Lord carry his cross. St. Veronica, who wipes the Lord's face and gives him something to drink. Or even someone like St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who made a habit of recognizing in the poorest of the poor Jesus in his distressing disguise. So again, corresponding to his invitation to recognize and also love Jesus Christ in the least of our brothers and sisters. Okay, but that brings us to the second thing I want to say to you. And so basically it's an invitation to think creatively about the problem. Individually for sure, but especially when it comes to group settings. So to illustrate the point is when I imagine oftentimes as a pastor, I'm approached by various parish groups asking for permission to run a particular program or event. In response to which, quite honestly, I often put it back to them in terms of inviting them to respect the process. And basically what I'm inviting groups to do is to not simply fall back on what's been done before, whether we're talking about last year or even 10 years ago, but instead to think creatively about the problem, to recognize that every age begins anew. And so perhaps the problems we identified before, they've changed or modified over time, and so therefore our solutions are meant to modify and change over time. And see, practically speaking, what this means is that people involved in parish groups are constantly meant to revisit certain kind of core questions. And so, for example, what does our group stand for? What are our values? What are our goals? And when it comes to our different programs and events, are these the best means to actually accomplish our goals or to realize our values? And perhaps most importantly, perhaps it might be a good time to revisit the ways in which you come up with solutions, to revisit the way that you actually communicate with each other in the context of the group. Mindful of the fact that the signs of a really good process include prayerful contemplation, like praying into the situation, collaboration, authentic communication, and also that you've drawn upon the various and complementary gifts and talents within your particular group. As a result of which, when you look at the final product or the end result, you can say with confidence that we accomplished this as opposed to I did this. And so, for example, let's say your explicit intention as a group is to raise money for the poor. Perhaps you might ask yourself, is what we're doing the best way to raise money for the poor? Or perhaps is there a better way to raise more money? And on top of that, perhaps it's a really good time, especially in this post-COVID world, to revisit the question of who are the poor? And so, for example, instead of giving money exclusively to international causes, perhaps there might be an opportunity to also give to more local causes, especially given a new awareness of who are actually poor and needy in the immediate community. Okay, but that brings us to the third thing I want to suggest to you. And basically the whole idea here is that when it comes to the corporal works of mercy, you're meant to look for an ongoing solution as opposed to a one-off solution. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember recently talking to representatives from the local homeless shelter in collaboration with other members of the parish staff. And basically the question we posed to them was, what's your most pressing need? In response to which they basically said, food. We primarily need food on an ongoing basis throughout the course of the week, throughout the course of the year, for the people who come to the shelter. And I remember when I first heard that, I thought to myself, well, gosh, that sounds kind of obvious, to the point of being embarrassing that it didn't occur to me that that would be the answer. But of course, that just speaks to the fact that a lot of times when it comes to attending the needs of the poor, we think of these things as a seasonal thing or a someday maybe thing. Like again, someday maybe I might help out at the homeless shelter or volunteer at the soup kitchen. Or perhaps I might be mindful of the poor simply during certain seasons, like Thanksgiving or Christmas, as opposed to, again, being mindful of their ongoing needs. How can we as a parish community help the poor and needy in our midst on an ongoing basis throughout the course of the year? And you see, in a certain sense, depending on how you look at it, this is the general exhortation when it comes to the invitation to, again, welcome the stranger or visit the imprisoned. Because even though it's true that these particular corporal works of mercy are meant to refer specifically to immigrants and people locked up in prison, at the same time, generally speaking, they're meant to refer to anyone who has no sense of family, friends, community. So maybe they're surrounded by people, but they don't have a sense of belonging or safety or trust. And so therefore they're experiencing, again, in a certain sense, what it means to be a stranger, what it means to be in prison. Okay, one final note, and I'll kind of end with this. And so as you probably all know, the general invitation is to let the world know that we are Christians based on the quality of our love, which hopefully it goes without saying is not meant to be limited simply to being nice or kind or polite, but instead is also meant to be tangible, concrete, inspiring, prophetic, radical, all-inclusive, mindful of both body and soul. And so the example that comes to mind, I remember once listening to the testimony of Sister Miriam James Heidland, who was recalling the story of how she was talking to her therapist about trauma she had suffered back in the day. And initially all she could handle was communicating by email these deep, dark secrets about her life. And the way she tells the story is that whenever she sent an email, she would always think to herself, well, this will be the day. This will be the day when my therapist says, you're crazy, you're gross, you're disgusting. Why are you a nun? Something like that. But the way she tells the story is that the therapist never did that. But instead, throughout this ongoing process of online correspondence, the therapist would constantly correct any sort of misconceptions that Sister Miriam had about her identity and self-worth, while at the same time constantly reaffirming her goodness in the midst of her past, in the midst of her brokenness. And I love that example, friends, because it reminds us that Christian love, authentic, real Christian love, is not meant to be arm's length, is not meant to be impersonal or abstract, but instead is meant to be intensely personal, intimate and personal, real friendship and connection with the other, because we're loving Christ in the other person. And so therefore, in addition to addressing people's various bodily needs, we're invited to be patient with people in their brokenness. And throughout all this, we're called to exercise extraordinary generosity in journeying with people through the peaks and valleys, through the ups and downs, through the darkness and bright spots of their lives, mindful of the fact that at the end of the day, that's what Christian love actually looks like. And at the end of the day, this is the thing that actually heals and redeems. And may God bless you all.